So good afternoon to everyone who's dialed in, and welcome to today's session. My name is Rahul Bhushan, and I'm one of the founders here at the Rize ETF. We are Europe's first specialist thematic ETF issuer, having pioneered thematic ETF investing in Europe back in 2014 with the launch of the continent's first robotics ETF. I'm joined here today by the full team, in fact, of experts from Tematica Research, who are the leading thematic equity research house in the US. Tematica Research have been our partner in the development of our Rize Cybersecurity and Data Privacy UCITS ETF. From the team, excuse me, we're joined by Professor Chris Versace, who is the Chief Investment Officer at Tematica Research, as well as their, excuse me, lead thematic strategist. Chris has over 20 years of experience in thematics, both in equity research and in managing assets, and is perhaps best known for pioneering the world's first thematic GICS framework and scorecard. We're also joined by Mark Absey, Tematica's head of indexing, who has been developing thematic investment products since 2008, including the most successful cybersecurity ETF in the US. We're also joined by Lenore Hawkins, who is Tematica's chief macro strategist. And interestingly, Lenore actually joins us from Italy, where she has been since the start of the lockdown. So looking forward to hearing those perspectives from her. So with that, hello to all the panelists, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Rahul.
Thank you, Rahul.
Thanks, Rahul. Go ahead.
So before we begin today's presentation, I need to address some simple housekeeping. One, please note that we've left time in the end to address any questions. If you'd like to ask a question during the webinar, please type it into the Q&A panel. You should see that at the bottom of your screen towards the left. And we will seek to address these questions at the end of the webinar. Also, please note that there's a button in the control panel to raise your hand for any technical issues. So if you're having any display or sound problems, raise your hand and we'll get an organizer to get in touch to resolve the issue. Finally, we're going to be distributing the presentation slides after the webinar is finished. So don't worry, you will get a copy via email from myself. So without further ado, let us begin our discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about the cybersecurity sector, as the name suggests. So this is a sector that is once again in the spotlight this year, but for an entirely new reason. We're talking, of course, about the adjustment we've all had to make to living and working from home, and what that means for our digital lives, and especially where our digital reliance has exploded in what seems to be overnight. So companies and governments are now thinking of new and innovative ways to protect their most valuable assets at a time where resource availability is scarce and the world is slowing down. Robust cybersecurity at a time like today has never been more important. So the purpose of today's presentation is threefold. First, we'll give an overview of the cybersecurity market in 2020. We'll be asking questions like, what are the implications of the coronavirus as it creates everlasting change and permanence in our habits and behaviors, and what this means for the security landscape? Two, we're going to look into what is driving growth in the cybersecurity sector today. Is it cyber attacks? Is it technology? Is it regulation? Is it privacy concerns? We're going to be unpacking these powerful tailwinds that we're seeing emerge today. And finally, number three, we'll seek to understand how investors can gain exposure to this exciting investment theme today and ride the growth wave of this theme in the months and years ahead. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Chris, Mark, and Lenore, so that we can dive right in.
Thanks, Rahul. Good morning, everyone. And as our name suggests, our focus at Tematica is indeed thematic investing, which in our view properly identifies structural changes and pain points that produce powerful multi-year tailwinds that benefit well-positioned companies, driving revenue, profits, cash flow, and EPS higher in the process. And in our collective experience, we find that drives multiple expansion. So in short, when it's done right, thematic investing helps identify alpha. Now, the topic of today's presentation is cybersecurity and data privacy. And that investment theme that we have benefits from the pain points generated by the ever-growing threat of cyber attacks, pervasive data privacy violations, and the impact of the evolving regulatory environment. As you'll see, not only is cybersecurity a growth market, but there are new technologies that will collectively open up new points of vulnerability and allow for new forms of cyber attacks and data privacy violations. Before we get started, we always like to set the table, as it were, and just go over a couple of definitional items. First, what is cybersecurity? It's the state of being protected against criminal or unauthorized use of electronic data, or the measures taken to achieve this. There's also two others that we'd like to discuss quickly. One, data security, which protects data from compromise by external hackers and malicious insiders. And then finally, data privacy, which governs how data is collected, shared, and used. Now, the sad point about all of this is that cybersecurity and data privacy attacks, they are nothing new. Yes, we've heard about them in the press quite a bit over the last few years, but the very first attack was recorded in 1988. Flash forward to October 2012, and then US Defense Secretary Leon Panetta warned that the US was facing the possibility of a cyber Pearl Harbor. And since then, people around the globe have only become more connected to more devices with greater bandwidth speeds, and all we've seen has been an explosion in the number of attacks. Some recent statistics, again, to set the table: hackers attack every 39 seconds, roughly 2,244 times a day. The average time to identify a breach at a company last year in 2019 was 7 months. And the average life cycle of a breach lasted almost 11 months, nearly a year. And that spans from breach to actual containment. And by the end of this year, security services are expected to account for almost half of IT and cybersecurity budgets. So when we look at those statistics, this tells us at Tematica we are facing a profound pain point. And as we've seen in the past as investors, pain points are wonderful opportunities for investors. And in this case, we can also layer on the growing passage of privacy regulations. Can I get the next slide, please? The key, though, is in identifying the companies that are most exposed to this thematic tailwind. And that's one of the key things that we do. We sift through thousands of publicly traded companies and run them through our thematic scoring process. So effectively, we are evaluating companies for their financial business exposure to a theme. We cull through public filings, conference call transcripts, company presentations, and talk with the company if need be to determine their exposure to the theme so we can derive their scorecard rank, which you can see on the screen. Companies with the greatest exposure rank 5, and we tier them all the way down to a 1, which has peripheral exposure. And based on the scores that reflect company reported data, we assemble our universe of companies. So it's a wonderful culling process, which we like to say separates the cream from the rest of the milk. We want to find the companies that are best identified to ride the tailwinds associated with each of our investment themes. The higher the rank, the greater the exposure. In this case, we're talking about cybersecurity and data privacy. And now, what I'd like to do is turn the presentation over to Mark.
Great, thanks, Chris. So now this slide is fairly self-explanatory. So I'll let viewers simply observe the activity. But when we think about cybersecurity, the image that comes to mind is one of encryption, including public and private keys, very large prime numbers, and the high-level math that powers it all. But if we take a step back, let's not forget that current technology is just a step in the evolution of data protection. Securing information and verifying identity are millennia-old processes that started with trusted couriers and clay seals, and today rely on trusted couriers in the form of identity verification and secure network access, and clay seals in the form of encryption. Increasingly, they are combined in what is known as end-to-end encryption, which not only wraps each message in encryption, but provides for a fortified route in between any and all participants. Data privacy, relatively new once companies realized that they could monetize customer data, meaning that once companies realized that their customers' data had value, they began to monetize it. And so you do have companies like Twitter, a lot of the social media companies, which when you talk to them about what their revenue stream is, it's their customers, right? Now, the map here is provided by FireEye, and FireEye provides cybersecurity services to governments and corporations alike. Now, they, like many cybersecurity companies, are privy to their clients' messaging traffic. The activity on the map you see here is real FireEye client data that has been anonymized and plotted real time. The map does a great job illustrating the frequency and global reach of cybersecurity issues. Now, for this attack map at 11 p.m. last night, my time, which is Eastern Standard Time, there were approximately 700,000 registered attacks, and that's a little over 8.5 attacks per second. Now, these numbers represent a subset of only FireEye customers, so you can well imagine globally that the numbers are staggering. The rotating globe in the lower left corner shows high traffic attackers over the last 30 days. Now, the top countries, not surprisingly, include the United States, Russia, and China, but also include Egypt, Algeria, and Myanmar. So if we move to the next slide. Now, this slide shows various kinds of attacks. Now, as we discussed, while the basic approach to message security hasn't changed over thousands of years, its methods have evolved with technology. Similarly, long ago, anyone looking to disrupt secure communication could do so, either by corrupting or otherwise compromising the messenger, or capturing the message en route and modifying or replacing the message contents altogether. When we look at how this can happen today, the basic approach is the same, but again, the methods have evolved. The messenger in this case not only includes you, the user, but also your device, and in some cases, your network. The methods include attacks like phishing, which I'll talk about in the next slide, or the installation of malware, like what happened in the recent Versace attack, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Analogous to intercepting and or modifying messages are man-in-the-middle attacks, where web traffic is captured or users are simply sent to a counterfeit website. Websites themselves are frequent targets of attack. Websites may be vulnerable to front-end attacks, including defacement or distributed denial of service attacks, which are conducted by flooding a website with traffic in order to overload it, or back-end attacks, meaning hackers are trying to access the databases that support the site's function. In case of transactional sites like banks, brokerage, and retailers, this data includes customer personal and financial information. Companies involved in protecting these attack vectors, as they're known, include LogMeIn and SailPoint, covering identity verification, Norton LifeLock, covering both devices and online identity security, Splunk, analyzing web traffic, looking for denial of service attacks, among other activity, Cloudflare, protecting and providing domain name services, and CrowdStrike, offering endpoint protection, in this case, servers. So, in the previous slide, I discussed some of the attack vectors utilized by hackers. The one vector that wasn't really discussed too much was users, was us. Now, this slide is a quick walkthrough of a recent email phishing attempt that I received. So we'll just walk through these numbers here. So number one, I received this email instructing me to receive a voicemail message from a company called LeapFile. Now, like any half-decent phishing attempt, there are plausible elements to the scheme. First is, I am an Office 365 user, and the email address is one I use on the platform. The second is LeapFile is an actual company that provides secure file delivery solutions. Now, the thing that struck me as odd is one, I don't use their services, and two, anyone who needs to get a hold of me can do so quite easily. So I downloaded the attachment, being careful not to launch it, of course, and I opened up this HTML file in Notepad in a basic word processor, all right? So on number 3, we see, well, in number 2 still, you see there's a very long string of a bunch of percentage symbols and numbers and letters. And I don't profess to be an expert by any means, but it seemed to me that that might be hex code, hexadecimal code. And so I went online and found there's any one of, number of free coders and decoders for this kind of thing. And basically all that long string of numbers turns into what is in number 3, right? And by the way, you've heard the term JavaScript injection. This is an example of a JavaScript injection. So you have in number 2 JavaScript code, right, which is wrapped in an HTML file, right? A lot of computers will say, I don't want to run JavaScript, but if they see an HTML file, they'll say, oh, I can run that. HTML is friendly, right? So this JavaScript in number 3, you can see, hopefully you can, but it actually is a direction to not anything Leap file, not anything Microsoft, but mountainzaptor.buzz. And so I took a look at that and I said, you know what? I wonder if that is an accessible place. So when we look at number 4, what I did is I went to my browser and I copied just the first part of that. And it indeed took me to the folder where whoever is running this hack has his files. And you can see that there's a recover.html, which is the package that's indicated here, in number 3. Now, what's interesting is that when I first got the email, it was May 20th, I think. When I went back on the 22nd, number 5 popped up. So between, in a couple of days that's been live, somebody had alerted, or the people at, I don't know if I guess it was Cloudflare, identified this as, this guy's trying to perpetrate some phishing attack. Right now, number 6. After looking through this recover.html file, I saw that it didn't seem to download and install anything, just provide a login page. So I clicked on it to get this screen. Now, had I clicked on the attachment in the email, my email address would have been used instead of the undefined account. Okay. And then number 7 is, if you can see on number 4, there's a text file, a .txt file. Well, that's the actual payload. That's the information that this guy is looking for, right? And basically what it does is, if you go through and put in your password, it comes back and says, oh, sorry, that password's no good. Please reset it. And you can, I don't know if you can see, I took out the password information in this, but essentially what it looks to do is not only capture a user's password on that platform, but if somebody tells you, oh, your password's wrong, a lot of people will just say, oh, it must be this other password, or it must be this other password. And so people who fall prey to this unwittingly end up giving up not just a password, but potentially other passwords, and even more importantly, if they have enough examples, a pattern of how they produce passwords. Now, your average user would not have taken these steps, and I wouldn't expect anyone to, but as long as people take that first step of asking, does this make sense? Then honestly, they are taking the most important step of all. Next slide, please. Okay. So as you know, and through the news, cyber attacks, as Chris said, are nothing new. They are ubiquitous. But the one thing that has been interesting to me is that while there are a lot of attacks and a lot of data is being compromised, there are a number of attacks which involve, frankly, hundreds of millions, if not billions, of records. And so you can see, and you should be able to recognize some of these names here. Again, this is a fairly self-explanatory slide. I'm not going to get too deep into each of these, but you can see that at least over the past 3 years, there have been a number of attacks involving more than 100 million records. Now, interestingly, earlier this month, the healthcare company Fresenius announced that it had been hacked through a ransomware attack. Now, this attack was interesting because it wasn't so much records that were compromised, and truly the details of how the attack were carried out were not released, but the company stated that while patient care was not affected, some manufacturing activities had been effective. Now, the ransomware that was used is known as Snake, and apparently has been developed to attack enterprise control tools and industrial control systems. Now, to me, this sounds like someone got a hold of the old Stuxnet virus and modified it so that it doesn't break machinery, but only cripple it until ransoms are paid. Again, a recent attack against British Airlines, against British airline EasyJet, accessed email addresses and travel details of approximately 9 million customers, including credit card details of over 2,000 companies. Again, there have been many, and there will be many victims of these attacks. Now, one thing that is interesting is there was earlier this year, there was a company called Clearview AI, which is a photo archive site for identity. Now, they were hacked in February of 2020. Now, the reason why they're not on this graph is because in that case, there were 3 billion records that were compromised. And quite frankly, had they been on the graph, it kind of would have broken the graph. So for that reason, it's not included. Next slide, please. So when we talk about records and we talk about personal information, what's the reason for people to try and grab this information to hack and get this information? In the early days of the web, in the early days of having information online, it was really to get the data, right? Someone wanted to get your ATM PIN number so they could empty your account, or they wanted to get other information so maybe they could take out a credit card in your name. And what's interesting here is, again, you can see the values attributed, kind of the, let's say, black market values or dark web values attributed to these types of information. And unsurprisingly, the more information helps create a complete persona or a complete identity, the more valuable it is, right? So social security number is basically the national ID number for the United States, right? So if you have a social security number, the government recognizes you as a citizen, and all the rights and privileges afforded to you, right? Including social services and including eligibility for many programs. But the point about that is that it's just one piece of data and doesn't really give you anything, right? Obviously, something like a passport is more valuable in that sense, and certainly something like medical records, which has a lot of information about you, has address information, billing information, as well as personal health information, also is more valuable. As, again, with a social security card, that's a good start, but there's still a lot of work for someone to do to create a new identity based off of yours. Next slide, please. All right, and it looks like I am passing it off to Lenore.
Good day, everyone. So let's take a step back and look at what's going on in the cybersecurity and cyber privacy with respect to the bigger picture of the world, the global economy, and in the context of the global pandemic. So as we've seen the physical world become increasingly dangerous, that's really pushed us towards adopting the digital world more quickly than we otherwise would have, which creates a lot of opportunities for these nefarious actors that Mark was just discussing. The pandemic has changed where and how many of us work, where and how we shop, and how we interact with one another. Many companies are finding that they have to protect the data and their communications, their internal communications, across a much wider spectrum and across a lot more employees, as a higher and higher portion of their workforce is ending up having to work from home. Now, the way companies operate is also being impacted, with many of them are having to move forward their plans to adopt greater levels of automation. For example, the clothing company Gap had to shift forward their automation because as they were forced to close most all of their stores and then had their employees working from home, the only way they could connect with customers was online. So that put a greater emphasis on warehouse fulfillment direct to the customer. But the problem was they couldn't just simply use more people to process more orders out of their fulfillment warehouses because of the complexities involved with social distancing, ensuring their employee safety, and also the possible potential liabilities coming out of that. So their solution was to accelerate their already planned adoption to increase the level of automation, primarily robotics, in their fulfillment warehouses. And then with those robotics, one more chance for these nefarious actors to get in and mess with what you're doing, potentially hold a warehouse hostage. And what we've seen, as with Gap, for years now, online retail has really been growing a lot faster in many parts of the world than brick and mortar. The pandemic massively accelerated that because shopping in the physical world for most people just wasn't even a choice. For example, online shopping is nearly doubling its share of grocery spending in the UK because of the government-imposed lockdowns. And in fact, in the 4 weeks ending May 16th, 7.9 million households placed an online grocery store order. Now that's up from 4.8 during the same period last year. So that's basically doubling. And as people get used to doing these things, they're unlikely to go back to the way things were before when they discovered this is actually a lot more convenient. We've also had to start video conferencing for work and also socially. Now that's been available for years, but the adoption has really accelerated when we really just couldn't meet anymore and when grandma couldn't go visit the kids, so we had to do it online. Now, what we're seeing is the humane and necessary response to the pandemic has really resulted in a lot more headwinds to global growth, which was already struggling. We've seen across the world record levels of unemployment in many countries. We've seen significant supply chain disruptions that are not only hurting companies' ability to fulfill, but are also increasing their costs. We're seeing increased health and safety needs that are also just adding additional costs. And then to add insult to injury, many businesses are also forced to deal with reduced capacity, which affects their ability to generate revenue, such as airlines, restaurants, retail stores. And then on top of it, we're going to see much, much higher levels of debt across all parts of the economy. And that debt, unfortunately, is not being used to increase future income generation, that kind of debt we like, but rather this debt is just being used to get people through the crisis, which means at the end of this, all that debt is just going to be higher costs. That means less investment in the future, that means less consumption, and that means lower margin. But the good news out of all this for investors is that growth was going to be even more elusive. So those companies that do have tailwinds will find increased demand for their shares. That's what we're looking at here. So the fear surrounding the pandemic has provided an awful lot of opportunities for cyber criminals, as Mark was just discussing. In the past couple of months, hackers have targeted the US Department of Health, and there have been attacks against the World Health Organization that have more than doubled. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said, "They follow us online. They exploit our concerns about the coronavirus, and our fears become their business opportunities." The COVID-19 pandemic has triggered an uptick in digital fraud and identity theft, with already 18,235 pandemic-related fraud reports received by the Federal Trade Commission just since the beginning of this year. So if we can move on to the next slide. In the current COVID world, millions of people are now working or attending school from home. They're working from home. They're using all kinds of networks that give hackers possible gateways into virtual treasure troves of sensitive data. A Forbes article from May 14th titled "Why the Largest Cyber Attack in History Could Happen Within 6 Months" pointed out this little bit. Hackers broke into the network of America's largest defense contractor, Lockheed Martin, by targeting remote workers, which, right, we have a lot more of these now. If those hackers can infiltrate Lockheed Martin system, you better believe that remote workers with little security and little experience are going to be easy pickings. Yep, the coronavirus has become quite a catalyst for all those bad actors. If we can move to the next one. Next slide, please. And these changes, this shifting the work from home is now not about whether to do it, it's about how to do it. And these changes, a lot of them look like they're going to be sticking for around for a long time. These companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Slack, Spotify, American Express, they've all said that they plan to keep this work from home in place throughout the rest of the year, most likely. Others are looking to make this a more permanent option. Companies like Facebook, Twitter, Square, Spotify, they're deciding to offer this option to employees on a more permanent basis. And as we were discussing earlier, that these headwinds to growth, that creates even further headwinds to growth in more sectors. Think about what that means for corporate real estate, what that means even for residential real estate in those areas that had been bid up so high because there was such a demand for housing, say in like Silicon Valley, in London, in these major centers, that maybe if you can work from home, you're not going to want to work someplace where you have to pay a fortune for a tiny little spot. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Lenore. So on this slide, we've hit you with a lot of heavy information, and we wanted to simply lighten the mood just a little bit before proceeding. So, this is an interesting cartoon. Who led the digital transformation of your company? Was it the CEO? Was it the CTO? More often than not, people are saying neither. It's really the pandemic that has forced us to alter our business model, as Lenore was just describing. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you're seeing several quotes that really discuss the surge in attacks and the forms that they're taking. As we can see on the right, the real surge, as Mark alluded to, has been in malicious spam emails. Again, as Mark described, not only for himself, but for the rest of us, we've received a number of phishing emails, whether it's for Netflix, Walmart, Amazon, Apple, other companies asking us to update our billing information, passwords, claim a discount code, or something else. And it's not just us. Cyber intelligence firm Cyfirma revealed that cyber threats related to the coronavirus shot up 600% from February to March. In more recent weeks, we've seen criminals using people's social security numbers, home addresses, and other information that they've previously obtained from past data breaches to assume their identities and bilk them out of their stimulus checks and unemployment benefits from the federal government here in the US. How big of an issue is it? The World Economic Forum recently cited cybersecurity as one of its top 10 fallout issues from COVID-19. Roughly nearly 38% of those surveyed say changing work patterns will lead to increases in cybersecurity and fraud incidents, just reaffirming what Lenore was pointing out. Companies are working to secure their new IT environments, and at the same time, hackers are seeking to exploit the stresses and distractions brought on by the pandemic. That's, again, the World Economic Forum, but also recently the FBI, their IC3, or its Internet Crime Complaint Center, reported a major increase in the number of cybersecurity complaints it's receiving each day. Before the pandemic, it was around 1,000 complaints. It's over 3,000 to 4,000 per day since the start of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So on this page, we have really two charts, as you can see. One shows the degree to which countries in the Eurozone are data secure. And as you can see, it's not very robust. On the right-hand side, you can also see the growth in the number of malicious spam attacks that have been happening. And the key takeaway here from this slide is the two graphics, when viewed together, show that cyber attacks are happening in the US, Europe, and elsewhere across the globe, and the vector and velocity of these attacks is only increasing as a result of the pandemic. Next slide, please. And here we've got some quotes from some companies or just who have recently reported their corporate earnings, and they really reflect the entirety of what we've been talking about, whether it's Okta saying that the shift towards the cloud is accelerating as a result of the pandemic, or CrowdStrike talking about how cybersecurity no longer a discretionary purchase. It is, as we like to think about it at Tematica, almost like insurance. A company may not know if or when they'll need it, but they'll be glad that they have it when they are attacked. And based on the increasing frequency of attacks that we're seeing, one could argue it's only a matter of time. And then from Cloudflare, which, just talking about the velocity of their business over the last several months, it just continues to accelerate. Each month the pandemic has continued. And from our perspective, there are other technologies that will be coming on stream in the coming quarters. Everything such as 5G, IoT, Internet of Things, longer term autonomous cars. And as they become commercialized, and as Lenore pointed out, it's simply more points of attack for hackers and other bad actors to exploit. Get the next slide, please. Now, so far, we've really talked primarily about cybersecurity, but as the graphics here show, it's not just cybersecurity that folks are concerned about, it's data privacy. And this is a snapshot in Europe, and when we look at it, we see that excuse me, that more than half of those surveyed in Europe by Deloitte are either security sensitive or security and privacy obsessed. That's not too far off the global framework, but roughly 53% of online users worldwide are concerned about their online privacy. That comes from Statista. And in the US, nearly half, or roughly 47%, feel they have little to no control over their personal data. And little factoid, 1 in 3 of those surveyed have had their data compromised. Next slide, please. So it's not surprising, based on that previous slide, that there are concerns about privacy, and we've seen a march to protect consumers' data privacy. And on this slide, we introduced the notion of GDPR, which I'm sure most are familiar with or have read at least something about, and there has been quite a bit written about GDPR. But to boil it down, if an organization doesn't safeguard or process an individual's data correctly, it can be fined. If there's a security breach, that company can be fined. And GDPR fines can be as high as 20 million euro or 4% of annual global turnover. This is the key part, whichever is highest. Now, when Mark was talking about EasyJet, he made reference to, I think, 9 million records being released. And if we're thinking about fines, if that were to have happened in California or in the US, where the California Consumer Privacy Act has gone into effect, better known as the CCPA, there's a maximum fine up to $7,500 per record in the violation. So some simple math, and we find out that that EasyJet violation, if it was, again, under the CCPA, that fine could approach as high as $67.4 billion. Few companies in today's world could survive that. And this is a message that effectively cyber attacks are being turned into a form of financial assault on companies, which is another reason for them to ingest and bring on incremental cybersecurity and data privacy services. Now, on this slide, we've got a couple different higher profile attacks. British Airways, $230 million fine. Marriott International was slapped with a fine of over $124 million for exposing a variety of personal data across 339 million guests globally, Virgin Media. But here's the thing. These are just some of the higher profile items in GDPR's first year. However, in that full first year, there were roughly 144,000 complaints filed with various GDPR enforcement agencies and 89,000 data breaches recorded. As of March 2020, over 230 fines have been issued, about 150 million euro. But again, if we look at the number of complaints filed, the number of breaches recorded, there is more coming. One other key point, it's not just GDPR. There are other data privacy regulations coming on stream as well. I already referenced California and the CCPA. New York has the Stop Hacks and Improve Electronic Data Security, better known as the SHIELD Act, that went into effect this past March. Other states in the US are formulating regulations for data privacy, and we're even seeing in Brazil, the Brazilian General Data Protection Law, better known as LGPD, that will go into effect this coming August. As a result, companies like Cisco are saying data privacy and regulations and their compliance are key drivers for cybersecurity spending going forward. And that market for global privacy management software is expected to grow to 1.6 billion by 2027, up from about 521 million in 2018. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we've got a number of different quotes that really speak to the rising demand for data privacy, whether it's from Ping, whether it's from Norton LifeLock, or overall data simply pointing to the rising requirements of data security and privacy protection as a result of GDPR. And again, we'd remind that it's not just GDPR. We're going to see far greater scrutiny, far greater reports on data privacy violations as more regulations are enacted. Next slide, please. So the big question is, what are the growth prospects for cybersecurity, data privacy, and more importantly, the earnings prospects for those companies that are serving that market? Well, when we take a look at the rise and forecast of cybersecurity, again, we touched on there are a number of things that are going to not only allow the continued growth of the market, but they're going to bring on new drivers, opening up new points of attack. Again, 5G, IoT, autonomous vehicles, and the like. So when we look at this forecast for cybersecurity for the worldwide market from 2017 to 23, it's a nice evolution of growth. However, the basket of companies in our cybersecurity and data privacy universe are expected to grow their EPS by 38% over the 2019 to 2022 period. That's a compound annual growth rate of 11.2% for the basket over the 2019 to 2022 period. How does that stack up against the benchmark that most investors use? That is the S&P 500. The S&P 500 over that period of time is only expected to grow 0.4%. So to put it together, we look at the growth prospects by the cybersecurity spend, data privacy spend as well. We run thousands of companies through our scorecard, and we identify those that are best positioned, given their business exposure to cybersecurity and data privacy tailwinds. That basket, that assembled universe, is poised to grow its EPS significantly compared to the overall market. Sticking with our notion of tailwinds, thematic tailwinds driving revenue, earnings, cash flow faster than the market, driving multiple expansion, identifying alpha. Next slide, please. And who are some of these companies that we've identified and have captured inside our universe? It's companies like Cloudflare that Mark mentioned that does DNS and DDoS protection, Okta, a cloud software company that helps companies manage and secure user authentication, Ping Identity, which offers identity services and authentication, and even Norton LifeLock, a cybersecurity and software and data privacy company. Just a few quick notes on our universe. It's reconstituted every 6 months, which we think is fantastic because it allows us to capture and incorporate new companies as they go public. Recent examples, CrowdStrike, Ping Identity, and Cloudflare. That also allows us to make adjustments for any type of corporate actions, whether they're M&As or spinouts. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Raul.
Thanks for that, Chris. If we turn to the next slide, please. So to build on what Chris was just talking about, and now we're getting into the actual investment strategy and the index that we've put together with Tematica to then ultimately be tracked by the ETF vehicle, which we have. So Tematica Research, as Chris was mentioning, they are dynamically managing a universe of companies that are exposed to the cybersecurity and data privacy theme. They've ranked those companies by virtue of their revenue purity or exposure to the particular theme. And then what we're doing is we are working together with an index provider to pull from that universe. So there's a universe that's dynamically managed, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. And then there's a passive, completely rules-based, systematic implementation in the investment strategy, which is required by an index. And then we've got the ETF, which tracks that. So this is the methodology, as you see it outlined here, that we use for all of our thematic ETFs at Rize ETF. We always partner with industry experts. In this case, we've got Tematica Research supporting the Cybersecurity Fund. And for all of our funds, in fact, we will be continuing as we expand the roster to partner with industry experts who are experts in those respective themes that we build products on, to pull from their insights and expertise and equity research capability to essentially feed the index that's sitting underneath. So I think this is a distinguishing feature of the Rize methodology, but certainly one that we've used in the past and we've been successful with, and one we'll continue to use. So here in the slide, you see how it works for the cybersecurity ETF. So if we go to the next slide. So here's a sample output of the actual stock universe. So we've taken the Tematica stock universe, and then here's a sample of companies and what the output looks like when we receive the universe of companies exposed to cybersecurity and data privacy from Tematica every 6 months. So you see the cybersecurity rank, which corresponds to the revenue exposure. We see a true false for data privacy. Is the company or not exposed to data privacy products and services? And then we also see a classification group here. We've got the high level classification group of products and services. But then if we start digging into that in detail, we end up with a number of sub-classifications that we also receive from Tematica, which we can also share for any interested investors. But that's the sort of high level classification. And then of course we've got the country of domicile. And so this forms the stock universe. And in the next slide, we'll see how that universe informs the actual index. So here we see a step-by-step guide as to how the index is built. So the first step, establishing the stock universe. Now this comes from Tematica Research, as Chris described, according to their proprietary classification and company purity scoring model. Now that is a universe of 106 companies. What we do at the index level then is the first step is excluding aerospace and defense sector companies. Now this is done for two reasons. In our analysis of the 106 companies together with Tematica, we discovered one that these companies have a relatively trivial exposure to cybersecurity products and services. And even worse, there are a number of companies in the aerospace and defense sector which also are very obvious and notorious ESG offenders. So these are companies like Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Northrop Grumman, even Thales and Rheinmetall, if you're in Germany. So there's a subset of companies there that we felt should not necessarily be represented in this basket, both for the ESG reason, but then also for the simple reason of that they don't have particularly high revenue exposure to the cybersecurity and data privacy theme, and we discovered that for all the companies in the aerospace and defense sector, it was less than 10%, and in any case, that doesn't meet the cutoff that we embed into the index. Step number 3 is the screen for thematic purity. So here, what we're doing is we're looking at the companies with a 1 to 5 rank, and we're excluding all the 2s and below. And so essentially, we're left with a basket, which is the highest pure play basket of companies with exposure to the cybersecurity and data privacy theme. Step number 4 is the traditional filters you would see in an index. So minimum market cap, minimum liquidity. For liquidity, we're using 3-month average daily value traded, so a dollar figure, and that we've set at 1 million. For market cap, we're using the free float market cap, and that's set at 100 million. So companies that don't meet those thresholds are excluded. We end up with 44 companies. And then finally, again, and this is something that is quite unique to the Rize approach. You know, we haven't seen it elsewhere in the industry. We use a purity-based weighting scheme. So again, we've pulled out of the universe the companies with the highest purity to the theme that we're trying to track, but then we're also giving assigning weights to the companies based on their purity. So the 2-tier purity-based weighting scheme essentially tilts weight towards companies that have that are driving the maximum amount of their revenues from the cybersecurity and data privacy theme. Across the index, we have a 93% revenue purity factor, which is significantly higher than some of the other products that you see out there. And then finally, there's a liquidity stress test that's applied. The last couple of months, even in the ETF world, perhaps more in fixed income, has really highlighted the importance of making sure you're buying a liquid product. Of course, with ETFs, they're just as liquid as the underlying constituents. So what the liquidity stress test is doing here, it's looking at a hypothetical creation of 35 million, and it's looking at how much of the least liquid constituent in the ETF will we have to trade, and how much of that least liquid constituent do we want to trade. It sets a cap, and then it works backward to figure out what the weight should be, and it does that in an iterative process. So that's explained further. If you're interested in learning more how that works, or the dynamic, or see it illustrated in an Excel spreadsheet, we can share that after this presentation as well. And then finally, the index is rebalanced semi-annually in June and December. So we have a rebalance coming up in the 3rd week of June. Next slide, please. And so this gives us a top-down view of the various characteristics of the portfolio. So what's really interesting on the left-hand side, so I'll go from left to right here. So country breakdown, we can see that the majority of the exposure of the basket is to US companies. Another country that's quite interesting and always has a high representation is Israel. What's really interesting about Israel is that if you look at the companies in the United States section as well, you will discover that a lot of those companies were actually born in Israel and then subsequently moved their headquarters to the US. So it seems to be a country that's really at the forefront of innovation when it comes to security software. And we're watching day in, day out, new startups pop up in that space, in that country as well. And then, of course, Japan and South Korea have always had a big representation in the cybersecurity universe. And so naturally, you would expect them to figure in the country breakdown as well. Subsector breakdown, we see the high-level classification here. And we've just shown here the products and services. So a very simple illustration of how the companies are split between product providers and service providers. Underneath that, we see the market cap breakdown. So I think there's 2 points to make here. One, much of the opportunity set today sits within the small and mid-cap sector. Now, what that means is, number one, this sector is nowhere near maturity yet. It's certainly in its early innings. It's certainly in a fast and rapid growth phase. And the reason for that, of course, is that if this was a sector that was close to its maturity phase, you would expect most of the opportunity set to be sitting in that large cap segment. But there's still, a lot of new companies IPOing. Last year we saw 4. We should probably expect a few this year as well. And so that's always interesting to see from an investment point of view. And then the second point I think that I'd like to make on the market cap breakdown is that what a lot of investors have told us is when they buy this product, they are usually accessing a subset of companies that they don't already hold in their portfolios as yet. Because a lot of the time, these small mid-cap companies, they don't feature in the major benchmark indices. And so clients are not typically holding these companies. So there is obviously the growth element to investing in cybersecurity, but buying a basket of companies that you don't already hold also benefits your diversification pool. So I think that's been a compelling case for a lot of the clients that we've spoken to in the last couple of months. On the left-hand side is the number I alluded to earlier, the 93% revenue purity. And on the top right, we have a couple of companies in our basket. So Chris mentioned, and Mark as well mentioned, Cloudflare. Now, this is a company that provides DNS solutions globally. It's potentially the largest cybersecurity company that you've never heard of. It's an exciting company for us. We've seen them post, quite record-breaking revenue figures even this year, which is in the middle of, in probably the worst period in 10 years. Here's a company that grew its year-on-year, quarter-on-quarter revenues by 48%. They came in at 91 million in Q1 of this year versus 61 million last year. So here's a company that's really benefited from this rapid shift to digital lifestyles and digital work, and especially the cloud, because Cloudflare is a company, as the name would suggest, that specializes in cloud security. Now, CrowdStrike, Okta is another one, in fact, that's very, very similarly in the cloud security space. CrowdStrike is another one. CrowdStrike is an interesting one. I do recall in March, as a result of the coronavirus, it fell quite a bit. It fell by around 6.5%, something like that. But then in April, when the earnings came in, it literally bounced back almost immediately. The stock was up, more than 20% in April. And of course, as you would expect, here's another cloud security company that's really experienced a boost as a result of this shift to digital. So again, another interesting company that we're keeping an eye on. Cloudflare and CrowdStrike both IPO'd last year. Zscaler IPO'd the year before. Okta, I think Okta IPO'd in 2017. So here you have, just by looking at the top 5 companies, it's really the new, innovative, modern players that are driving the growth in this sector at the moment, and that's certainly interesting to watch from an investment point of view. If we go to the next slide. So here's an illustration of how our index. We don't have a full year performance for the ETF yet, so we can't really show it. The index is in pink. That's the index that our ETF tracks. Now that index went live on the 10th of January of this year. So from basically, aside from the first 10 days of this chart, all of it is live performance. So we've seen it rise and do particularly well this year, especially versus competitors. One of the competitors is the black one that you see there, which is another cybersecurity ETF in Europe. And then, of course, you can see the comparison versus the MSCI All Country World as well. The reason we've used MSCI All Country World here is it's a global basket, and it's also it's heavily weighted towards mid caps, and so we wanted to represent something that was global and representing the small and mid cap sector very much in the same way as the cybersecurity universe does. If we go to the next slide. And this is just a longer term chart, so we can see the performance over time. Now, a lot of this is back tested, but it's worth mentioning that prior to launching the Rize Cybersecurity and Data Privacy UCITS ETF, we as a team, the Rize founders, we ran another cybersecurity fund for 5 years, and we can share information about that. So when we think about track record, as a team, as a unit, we've got over 5 years of track record managing cybersecurity investments. And of course, the new Rize ETF is our new fund as part of our new business. But we've been looking at this space for a large number of years. If we jump to the next slide. And here is the previous chart, essentially represented in numbers. So for those of you who are interested in understanding the numbers behind the chart, this hopefully gives a good overview of how the index or the industry has been doing over the last 4 or 5 years. So we see that 2019 was one of the best years for the industry. 2017 was also a great year, and this year, it's off to a good start, and we suspect that this shift impetus toward digital lifestyles is, again, to reinforce the point Chris and Mark and Lenore and all of us have made, is only going to increase and rapidly push this sector upwards. And that's exciting to watch. And it's also, as we start seeing the earnings come in from Q1, but also last year, we were certainly expecting that this pandemic, bad as it is, will provide some positive tailwinds to these companies, and it'll be an exciting place to watch, and certainly one that we expect to grow rapidly from here on. If we jump to the next slide. So finally, here's the slide which gives some information about our ETF. So the name of the ETF is the Rize Cybersecurity and Data Privacy UCITS ETF. The ticker on the Deutsche Börse is RCRS. So if you're searching by ticker, RCRS is what you need to type. The ISIN code is there as well. Couple of points. It's a UCITS fund. It's domiciled in Ireland. It's accumulating, so it's not paying out distributions. It's capitalizing all the dividends. And of course, it's a physical, full replicating ETF, as all of our products are. We've rolled out 2 ETFs, and we'll shortly be launching 2 additional ETF. And the house view here at Rize is, we'll never really go synthetic. We're always going to be launching physical, full replicating ETFs. And finally, registered countries at the bottom there. We've got all the major countries. We're waiting for, at the moment, we're waiting for the Austrian and the Luxembourg registrations. They're unfortunately taking a little longer, but we're still allowed to speak to investors in particularly in Austria to flag, so long as they're professional investors. So, hence this webinar. So we expect, that registration to come in the next few weeks. If we go to the next slide. So that finishes us up. And so that is the end of the presentation. And we do have time for some questions. So just a reminder, if you've been listening in and you've got some questions, please type it into the Q&A panel and we will see it. So all the panelists will see it the moment you type it in and submit it. I can see a few questions coming in already. And maybe we can kick off with something a little lighthearted. Mark, perhaps this one's for you. So why don't we start with this one? What are some simple things that people can do to protect themselves online?
Okay. Well, certainly there are a lot of things people can do, but the basics are, and I alluded to this in my earlier presentation about the phishing attempt, is to frankly just be vigilant and ask yourself a couple of quick questions, right? Especially with emails, does this make sense? Do I even have secret special points I'm going to lose, or whatever the enticement is for you to click on the attachment. One of the things that I always tell folks is, if you get an email from a provider, a bank you use, a brokerage that you use, and they're trying to get you to log in from the email, if you think it's really something that's worth paying attention to, then simply go to the website, log into your account in the website. If it's a bona fide event that they're trying to bring to your attention, there will be something active, or you would have received a message in your actual account. Okay. Another item which is becoming more and more useful and prevalent is the use of VPNs. As you know, in this day and age, free wireless access to the internet is ubiquitous. In some cities, it's even available just as you walk down the street. Now, using a VPN basically means that from your device to that node, if anyone does intercept your traffic, all they're going to see is what's going on between you and that node, right? It's like an opaque tunnel. So they can just see that you're connected to a node, but they wouldn't be able to see what's going on. And in fact, from that node in the VPN is where all of your activity goes out from. You know, on the data privacy side, again, vigilance is key. And also, you know, it's often been said lately that if you're doing something on the internet and it is free, then you are the product. So just be mindful as to what platforms you're going on, what of your personal information you're giving, right? You know, those are some quick things. The main thing is be vigilant, and just ask those questions. Take the time to slow down and say, okay, does this make sense?
Thanks for that, Mark. You touched upon privacy there. I think it's definitely a topic that's on a lot of people's minds at the moment, especially with, you know, the stories of surveillance that we're reading coming out of Asia. Could you, and perhaps this is a question I see coming in as well, and it's more around the privacy aspect. Chris, perhaps this one's for you, and you touched upon it in one of your slides with Norton LifeLock and Ping. But could you talk to us a little bit about the privacy sector and you know, how you see companies emerging within that subsector?
Well, I mean, I think privacy is going to be one of those things that is a developing but vibrant market as a result of increasing regulation around the globe. So that creates a tremendous, you know, pain point for companies, and the need to respond to that, if only to protect themselves. You know, as we use the example with EasyJet and the CCPA fines, if, you know, you approach something, you know, towards an individual attack, depending on the number of records, it could, you know, put an individual company out of business. Hence my comparison to that aspect of cybersecurity, almost like insurance. And I think we've seen some interesting solutions already hit the market, but the nature of the equity markets is that we will likely see even more solutions to be had as companies look to prevent, not only prevent, but identify and thwart newer types of attacks across newer devices. So from our perspective, the data privacy aspect is vibrant, and it's also a differentiator compared to some other products that are out there that really just focused on cybersecurity. So from that perspective, both growth and differentiation, we really like the opportunity tied to data privacy.
Thanks, Chris. So staying on the topic of growth, I can see that somebody else has asked another question here, which is, are cybersecurity companies attractively valued today? What's your thoughts? What's the sort of Tematica perspective on that?
Well, so, you know, I think the question is, you need to, well, the answer is this: you need to value the future growth of these stocks versus their earnings and the growth potential of the marketplace. And as we saw on a previous slide, they're clearly going to grow in advance of the overall market as measured by the S&P 500 over the next several years. I suspect, however, that given the frequency of attacks that have been increasingly reported coming out of the pandemic, the number of data privacy violations that have been reported but yet to be filed up on, there is a lot more growth underneath for these companies than has been currently being reported or reflected in earnings expectations. So I would argue that these stocks are probably not overvalued. I imagine that in some cases there might be some that are overvalued, but as a basket, I don't think that's the case. And I think that over the next several months, we're going to see a lot of catalysts, unfortunately, perhaps identified attacks that will serve to spark demand for this type of security class.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that, Chris. I can see a new question has just popped up. So as a potential investor, what are your plans for dividends, reinvestment, or payout? So this is a capitalizing ETF. So all the dividends that are paid out, it's around 1% on the basket. So what you find is that a lot of cybersecurity companies just reinvest in growth. And so, there's very few that pay out dividends aside from a few of the large caps. And, what we do in our ETF, because it's not a distributing ETF, is the dividends are essentially reinvested. And that's what the index does as well. And so the ETF is essentially replicating what the index is doing. Hopefully that answers that questions. Just gonna wait to see if there's anything else coming through. If not, I think we can perhaps wrap up. I think that's the last of it. So I think I would like to thank everyone for attending today's session once again. And also Chris, Mark, and Lenore, thanks for your time and for sharing your market insights with us. As I mentioned at the start, we will be sharing a copy of the presentation via email, but please feel free to reach out to us on info@rizeetf.com. So that's info@rizeetf1word.com. If you have any follow-up questions or would like to discuss further with either ourselves or Chris and the team, who are available for any questions or follow-up conversations. So yeah, please let us know if that's what you would like. And so with that, thanks to everyone again for attending, and we hope you have a great day.